always a bittersweet day because this means that if it were a short session, we'd be signing dying today, but instead we've got 45 days left. But House of Origin cutoff was yesterday. There were in the House some bad bills that passed, but also a lot of bad bills that House Republicans were able to play a part in helping to stop. So that's encouraging. One of the things that Republicans have been talking about since before session started, frankly for the past couple sessions, is the need to make Washington safer and more affordable and a better place to raise your kids with better schools. And unfortunately, we did not make a lot of progress in solving those problems. But we did make some progress in ensuring the problems didn't get dramatically worse. Legislative Democrats had a slew of bills that would have made Washington more expensive and less safe, and a lot of those didn't make it past cutoff. So that is somewhat promising. There was a slew of bad public safety bills that would have allowed violent criminals to get released early, reduce penalties for gun crimes. Those bills died at House of Origin cutoff. There is a bill to allow state bureaucrats, rather than the voters, to decide who was qualified to be. That bill died. There was bills to give personal computers to prisoners. That bill died. Early release for murderers. That bill died. Giving more judicial discretion to activist judges. That bill died. So pleased that while we still have plenty of work to do to actually make Washington more safe, some of the really terrible bills that have contributed to the culture of lawlessness and culture of unsafety did not pass. There were some other bills that Republicans worry will make Washington less affordable. A lot of those involve taxes. Because taxes are necessary to implement their budget, not a budget, but the Democrats' budget. They are exempt from the cutoff rules, so those ones are technically still alive. So we've got some work ahead of us for the next 45 days. Forgot to introduce, sorry, Chris. With me from the House is House Republican Deputy Leader Chris Corey from Yakima, and then I will turn it over to Senator John Braun from the Senate.
Well, great. Thanks, Drew. And thanks, everyone, for being here in person. It's good to see you in person. We've become accustomed to a virtual press conferences, so it's hard to know how to react. But here we are, week 9. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the work you're doing. This is a challenging year, as you know, here in the legislature and for Washington State, and the work you do to let people broadly around the state know what we're doing is critically important. So we appreciate your work, and we appreciate you being here. I will shorten, because I have many of the same comments as Drew did. Our priorities remain the same, and I think we made some progress in both some positive steps and holding back negative steps when it comes to our priorities. Public safety, I think we stopped, as you mentioned, a number of bills that would have made it easier on criminals, harder on victims, and I think that's a good thing for the state of Washington. I was disappointed we didn't move Senator Holy's bill to put $100 million more into law enforcement out of the Senate, but they did move a similar bill out of the House, and I think that will be the vehicle as we pursue that policy going forward. I have talked to the governor's staff about that, and we think that there is a path forward to get that funding to our municipalities around the state. So we're not done there, not exactly on the path we originally intended, but we're not done there yet. On affordability, there's a number of bad policy bills that we stopped. There's a few that we didn't stop. I think the biggest one is the unemployment insurance for striking workers. That really is, again, if it moves forward, it's going to be really hard on our business community. It's something only a couple states in the country have done, and that was some time ago. States who have considered it more recently, including California, have decided that's a bad idea, and I just say it's fundamentally unfair. There's about 15% of our workforce are unionized. They have every right to unionize, organize, and strike if they choose to, but to put the cost of doing that, socialize that cost of doing that on the backs of all workers just seems fundamentally unfair to me. The other point I would make is, look, by and large, I think you could very accurately say workers are in the driver's seat right now. Anybody that paid attention during the Boeing strike here in Washington last year, or the many strikes we've had over the last year and a half, whether it's rail or auto workers or screenwriters, you can see pretty clearly workers have been in a great position to negotiate for better compensation. Good for them. I think that's fine. But putting our finger on the scales more in favor of them here in Washington, I think is going to be very hard on an economy. And I think ultimately that affects affordability broadly in our state. As Drew mentioned, the biggest issue on affordability I view this year as the taxes, and it's well known, they're out there, the ideas that the Democrats have for new taxes. Oddly, it's not been got much discussion. I think that'll change in the second half of the session. This second half of the session is really going to be about the budget and about how we balance the budget, and if they push for new taxes, I think that's going to become a much larger part of the conversation. And then finally on K-12, public education, I think some good progress, some concerns. I think the progress is the MSOC bill, broadly supported, to make sure that we're covering the cost of maintenance or materials, supplies, and operating costs for our school districts around the state. We just passed the last bill from yesterday as we approach cutoff was the special education bill. Big bill. I mean, this is an area I've been working on for many years. We've made incremental progress over the last 5 or 6 years. This is by far the biggest step. You know, I'd be candid with you, I have some concerns about the cost. It's about a $2 billion bill over the 4 years, so it's very expensive. It's an important issue. I think it'll continue to get negotiated in the House. We'll see where that comes out, but I think the idea that we're finally getting attention across the political spectrum to special education is a good thing. Finally, I would want to mention the budget that the Senate Republicans rolled out on Tuesday, and acknowledge the good work of Senator Chris Gildon and Senator Nikki Torres, who spent weeks working through that and came up with what we're suggesting is a third way. You've seen the budgets that have been talked about so far. Governor Inslee's Book 2 budget that relied on excessive new taxes, I think $13 billion in new taxes, added significant new policy in our state at a time we can't afford it, and really I don't think gave us a very good path forward when it comes to impact to our economy and ultimately impact to citizens around the state in terms of the cost of living. You saw the Book 1 budget, which has been highlighted recently by the House Democrats, that is simply a slash and burn budget, and not, in my view, a real budget. I think you could safely say that is propaganda as they set the stage for advocating for new taxes. What we offer is a third way that simply relies on restraint, using all available resources, recognizing that this is not a year where we can afford to invest in new policy, even new policy that we broadly agree on. Sometimes you have to make hard decisions, and the most important thing is that we don't go backwards in terms of services, particularly to our most vulnerable, that we fully support education, both K-12 public education and higher ed, and I think that our budget that we proposed does that. And while I'm sure there will, never have a budget that pleases everyone, that just doesn't exist. I think if you look deeply into it, you'll see there's a lot of good things in that budget, and where we find savings, it's very reasonable savings that doesn't impact services to our state citizens. So with that, I will stop, and I love to have your questions. Oh, one more thing I forgot. I'd like to introduce Senator Short, who is our floor leader and does a terrific job on the floor. She's really led our efforts over the last week and a half as we battled it out on the floor of the Senate. So I think we're to questions.
Rep. Corrigan, Rep. Stokes-Berry, it was a late night, early morning. Lots of debate over the amendments on 1296, which ultimately went through. I guess just what are your thoughts? I mean, this was, I know, something that both of you fought pretty hard against and that you're passionate about. Did it feel defeating? What is your sense of where it's at right now?
So a couple thoughts on that. One, the 1296 obviously is gutting the Parental Bill of Rights that was initiative to the legislature, passed last year, really didn't even get fully implemented due to some, hesitancy, I'll put it politely, with the Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Ragdoll, and then went through the courts. The court said it was fine and it was okay, but here we are with a bill that was introduced before it was even settled in the courts, claiming that we needed to fix the confusion. It's obviously disappointing, because I think that parents in our state are continuing to feel like they are being pushed away from their children, that the state believes that it can do a better job of caring for its children. And that's not a Republican-Democrat issue. This is, I hear about this from some pretty liberal parents in my district that are pretty tired and fed up of the state trying to interject itself between them and their children. It's sad. I wouldn't say it's defeating, right? I mean, we were here till 2 a.m. last night fighting for parents and fighting for kids, and we were highlighting over and over and over again with our amendments and on final passage why it was so important not to roll back the Parental Bill of Rights. So I think that is, I think that's a good thing. I think that really energized our caucus. We were ready to show that this is an area where we're going to stand up for parents in Washington State. You know, the last thing I would add is the frustrating part in it was that they placed an emergency clause in it, which basically prevents a referendum, and that is becoming more and more common, and it's really frustrating because I feel like that's circumventing the constitutional right provided to citizens to have a referendum on legislation we pass here. And then when we asked to put one in to actually give it a referendum to people, we were flat out told no. The message I got was that we know better, we're sent here to make the laws, and the people can live with them. And that's disappointing.
Yeah, I mean, last night is Exhibit A for why the people are losing trust in politicians. 400,000 people signed an initiative to give parents more rights over what happens to their kids in schools. Almost exactly 1 year ago, Democrats like Sharon Tomiko Santos and Lillian Ortiz Self, even Speaker Jenkins at Media Availability, they all stood up and said that the Parents' Bill of Rights is worth doing. It doesn't really change very much. It mostly just reorganizes the law and repeats things that are already being done, and there's no reason we shouldn't pass it. A year later, they now want to completely unravel it. So were they being disingenuous now, or were they being disingenuous then? It's got to be one of the two. And to Chris's point, I mean, just fundamental difference between the two legislative caucuses about the role that they see the state playing and the role they see parents playing. Like Chris said, it shouldn't need to be a partisan issue, but somehow the majority Democrats here in the legislature have turned it into one. If you go out and ask regular people, 80% agree with Republicans on this issue. 20% agree with the Democrats. The Democrats are being incredibly radical in this. If anybody, I've got a fifth grader. If anybody has a 10-year-old or somebody who's older than 10, think back to when they were 10. Go look up the standards and curriculum for sexual education for fifth graders in Washington, and look it up for fifth graders in Texas. And tell me which one you think is the more appropriate curriculum for the 10-year-olds that you know. Fundamental difference, and legislative Democrats are radical, and as we saw last night, hypocritical, because first they said the bill was fine, then they said it wasn't. Who knows?
Yeah, and to add one more thing, Representative Stokesbury brings up a good point. One of our members, Representative Orcutt, actually tried to read some materials on the House floor and was gavelled down for being too graphic. And if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know, if your materials are too graphic to be read on the House floor in front of legislators who are setting that standard, then at a minimum, parents have a right to see those materials, and at a maximum, those things should be removed from our schools, especially given the atrocious, testing rates we're seeing across our state.
And I'd like to add a point to that. In the Senate, we also had our version of the bill, but I wanted to highlight that there was actually a bill that it would significantly change how the signature gathering is on initiatives. When you think about what's going on with the Parent Bill of Rights and you step back, it's also threatening that process, making it much harder, really calling into question, how signature gatherers do their things, fines, potential jail time. What we knew from learning from the Secretary of State's office, they do a really good job at making sure those signatures are accurate. And if you think about going out and getting signatures, you usually collect many more than what you need, just in case some of those fall off. But it was really, again, I think whether it's parents or other issues, they don't want the citizens of Washington State to say they disagree with what they're doing in the state of Washington, and to have a process that recognizes the citizens, Washingtonians' right to initiate a petition either to the legislature or directly to the voters. And so I think both of those really send a very seriously bad message that the voters don't count, and I think that's inherently wrong.
Senator Peterson just told us that he thinks he has the votes for rent stabilization as long as some dials get turned, maybe mess with the percentage. Do you see any way that bill passes out of the Senate after what passed in the House?
I think it's certainly in question. I don't think, I would disagree with him. I don't think today he doesn't have the votes for the bill that's before us right now. Now, would a negotiated bill make it through? I think that depends. I'd go back to his comments early in the session where he proposed passing a suite of pro-development, pro-builder, pro-housing bills along with rent control. Right now, I think, whether or not we have what you would consider a good suite of pro-bills is a question. I think there are some that have come out of both chambers. I think we have maybe a few more in the Senate than the House, which makes me worry that I'm not sure some of the stuff that made it through the Senate will make it through the House Democratic Caucus. And if it doesn't, if you don't have that suite of pro-builder bills, because broadly, we're not, our position on this has not been really a Republican position. It's simply been a market position that says, if you talk to most economists, they'll say, this is an access issue. This is the cost is be driven by insufficient housing. We need to build more. We know that we can't build more as the government. We have to get the private sector more engaged in our state. To do that, we need a better regulatory system. That's broadly agreed to. And to Senator Peterson's earlier comments, if we do that, then he thought that rent control could go forward. So I think it has to do with do we actually get a really robust suite of pro-housing, pro-builder bills that will help us long term? And B, are there negotiations on the rent control bill that make it less bad is how I would describe it. Right now, even with some good changes that were made on the floor of the House before it came over, it's still what I would consider the worst in the country. We have 5 other states with rent control in our country. Not only would we have rent control with this bill passed, we would have probably the worst one in the country, almost surely to discourage folks from investing in our state. I mean, even if they're just looking at the West Coast, they would look at this current bill and say, look at the rent control in Oregon and California and decide Oregon and California are better markets than Washington. That is absolutely not the place we want to be, and I don't believe we have votes if that's the way they want to go forward.
And just to elaborate for some context in terms of the House changes, the headline on this bill is rent control and a cap on what landlords can charge year over year to rent their unit to tenants. The amount of statute it takes to put that law into place takes up about a page and a half. The original rent control bill was something like 42 pages. So there was a lot in this legislation beyond rent control. There's limits on application fees and late fees and deposits and pets. There's limits for manufactured housing in addition to residential housing. There's a lot. There's a provision in the bill that says originally it said that you cannot charge a lower rate for a longer term rental. Doesn't make any sense to me why we would want to be discouraging or prohibiting landlords from offering a lower rental rate to somebody if they're willing to commit to a longer term lease. But that was in the original bill. We negotiated at about 5 in the morning to cut that bill in about half. It still has the cap, but it went from about 42 pages to 21 pages. So text-wise, almost exactly in half. There's still some things that are a big problem besides the cap on rent control. I mentioned this parity for month-to-month leases. The bill now allows for up to 5% variance. I still think it makes sense to have let landlords and tenants agree to what they want to agree to. There is an exemption for new construction designed to ameliorate some of the concerns we have about this stifling the supply of new housing. We were able to increase that from a 10 to 12-year exemption. It should probably be about 20 years. The intent of the legislation is to only apply on a tenant-to-tenant basis, so that rather than a unit-to-unit basis, so that if the tenant moves out, then the unit can be restored to market rate housing. The bill is probably clear on that point for residential tenancy, not totally clear for manufactured housing tenancy. So there's a lot of things beyond just the cap itself that are hugely problematic. We fixed some of them, but there's a lot of other challenges that remain, even aside from the price cap that, as any first-year economics student will tell you, creates a mismatch of market forces that will not properly allocate housing to the people that need it.
Actually, I disagree a little bit. I think it will allocate housing, but it's going to be out of the state. We're seeing a lot of our multifamily residential developers that are here in this state say, all right, we'll just go build other places, whether it's Idaho, Tennessee. They're going all over the place. So it's definitely pushing it somewhere else.
Our floor leader, April Connors, made that point in her floor speech, that this is a great bill. long pause for builders in Arizona and Idaho and Texas.
I would add, actually, if I may jump back in, one thing I'd like to specifically highlight is preemption. Right now, there's no, if this were to pass, there's no preemption in our state because right now what we have is a piecemeal. As you have folks who are in the state and are trying to manage this in the state, they have different rules in multiple different cities. If we're going to do this, and I very clearly don't think we should do this, at the very least, we should do one set of rules for everyone in the state. And right now, this bill does not include that.
What are the Republican priorities on housing that are still in play, and what as those we move forward with the remaining time we have, shifting to the other chamber? What's still alive?
Well, I think the biggest bill that has come over from the House to the Senate that we'll work on is the lot splitting bill. This is a bill that has made it out of it's odd. It's made now the House, I think, 2, maybe 3 times now.
3 times.
With pretty good bipartisan vote, and is not made it through the Senate. So I think it's a good bill. I've supported it for a number of years. It's a bill that probably helps our Democratic colleagues, their districts, more than our districts, generally speaking, although I think maybe the 31st is an exception to that. But it helps broadly nonetheless, and it's a bill that makes good sense. It allows for more density. It allows for lower cost entry-level homes. Good bill that we ought to be focused on. And we've had trouble with a couple members in the Senate Democratic caucus who have strongly opposed this for reasons I've never fully understand, but I'm hopeful this year we can overcome that. That's probably going to be my top focus in terms of bills that came over from the House during the first half of the session.
There's a couple that have made it through the Senate. They're in the House, and one of them is Senator Wilson's on kit homes. And really, when you think about those prefabricated structures that tend to be more affordable, making sure that those can be done and regulated in a way that doesn't make them prohibitive, but obviously safe. And so we'll see how that bill gains traction. Again, from an affordability level, there's also one, and on commercial, there have been a couple on commercial redevelopment. If you have empty spaces that can be turned into residential development, maybe multifamily homes in and around urban centers, those make sense. I was disappointed that it appears that it's not moving forward on the detached. They call them ADUs. We're an acronym-driven world. But the sad part about that, the real poison pill, was actually requiring water metering, when there are provisions in the bill that say that you obviously have to have potable water, you have to have available water to do your development. For us, for my district, and in a very rural area, those are really potentials for affordable development in a way that keeps with doesn't do urban sprawl, if you will, and really keeps the nature of our environmental surroundings. But I was sad to see that was really in there to allow a bill potential advancement. I was really bummed by that, frankly. So, we'll stay tuned.
Yeah, Shelley and John mentioned kind of the 2 big House bills that made it to the floor calendar. Lot splitting, which thankfully passed, and like John said, will be over in the Senate now. And there is a House rural accessible dwelling unit bill as well. There's one in the Senate. John and I were texting about this probably more frequently than any other topic over the last couple days, trying to get one of our bills through our chamber, and just couldn't get either one onto the floor. Unfortunately, that's disappointing. Same thing happened with this bill last year. But I will point out that this shouldn't be a partisan issue. One of the comments I've made over the past couple of years is expressing gratitude that the question of increasing housing supply is no longer very partisan. There's a lot of Democrats that do recognize the key to solving affordability is to build more units. Denny Heck wrote a really comprehensive report talking about the need to build more units. Now Senator Bateman, former Representative Bateman, Democrat from right here in Olympia, that has worked really hard to increase housing supply. So this isn't a partisan thing where Republicans are the only ones saying build, 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 and Democrats are saying don't. There's plenty of Democrats that agree that we need supply-oriented solutions, but they've just been unable to deliver. When Republican bills like lot splitting make it to the Senate, they die. When Republican bills like rural ADUs make it to the House floor calendar, they die. Strom Peterson, the chair of the Housing Committee, kept standing up on other bills, talking about how many great supply-oriented bills were coming through the House this year. There's not any besides the two I just mentioned. There's plenty that were introduced that didn't make it out of his committee. John mentioned that Senator Peterson said that in addition to passing rent control, Democrats would pass a lot of other supply-oriented bills. None of them come out. Republicans don't need our names on these bills. We just want to build more housing to make housing more affordable for our constituents. If that means having a Democrat be the prime sponsor, we are fine with that. But they are not passing bills to increase supply despite paying lip service to that being what is needed to solve the problem. And that's frustrating.
I would add, a lot of the bills that came out of the Senate, without going into individually, and I can give you a list if you'd like afterwards, a lot of them had to do with the Growth Management Act, which has been a tough issue. And I think we made some progress there, but I would tell you it's mostly on the margins. It's on the and I think it will pay off eventually, but it will take. I mean, remember the Growth Management Act. The entire thing relies on a 10-year planning cycle. So none of that stuff, while important, is going to have an effect next year, even if passed. It doesn't mean it's not good. Doesn't mean we shouldn't support it. But we continue to shy away from the harder issues, which is overregulation, a stable energy code, and supply of land, which is either more density or more greenfield land, and that's been a real challenge. We've made some progress with middle housing a couple years ago, but lot splitting has been very difficult, and new land has been very difficult. So,
yeah, I think the hardest part is when we have people that are willing to work together on trying to figure something out. We've got some other interested parties down here in Olympia that have much different ideologically driven motives, and so they oftentimes will try to put their thumb on those things. I can think of one particular group out of Seattle that continues to push back on development on my side of the state, and that's really frustrating because their whole notion is we want to keep rural Washington rural, and my response is yes, but we still need a place to live. And so if you're going to come in to my communities where you don't live and tell me I can't do something, it gets pretty frustrating, and it's not based on, I would say understanding how growth works and how you should do things. It's just about saying no and thinking that you've done something good when really all you've done is hurt working families.
There's one additional piece that we haven't talked about, and that's the State Building Code Council. I had a bill this session, bipartisan bill, to actually do some slight changes to the membership of that committee, make it a little bit more balanced. We were hearing from folks in the trades that were left because they disagreed with the way the State Building Code Council was doing their work, were then all of a sudden not reappointed. And so we don't have plumbers, if you can believe that, on the State Building Code Council. But it's really about being thoughtful and making sure that the codes they're putting forward are achievable and doable, and yet keeping development reasonable. And so I'm excited to be on that committee, I think. And so we'll see how things move going forward. The bill did not advance, but when you look at natural gas and the fact that the initiative passed and they refused to actually basically implement it, there's just been challenges. We want to see it more balanced, less political, and we'll see how it is going forward. But there need to be some changes there too.
Other questions?
I would ask about another housing bill that you didn't mention, transit-oriented development, that passed out of the House, and I have not looked at all of the provisions of where that stands right now, but just wondering if you could talk at all about how you guys are feeling about that and where that proposal kind of stands as it moves into the Senate.
Well, I think consistent with what I said before, Republicans want to see more supply. One of the challenges when it comes to how some of the transit-oriented development bills have been written is Republicans worry that it risks disincentivizing construction outside of that area. So yes, we are all for more density most places, and more density near transit stops makes a lot of sense. But to do so at the expense of disincentivizing density in other urban areas, but not right by a transit stop, that's where sometimes we have a problem. So we just want to take a little bit more holistic view. Yes, encourage development and density near transit stops, but do so in a way that doesn't discourage and punish developers for building outside of that. So that's the balance we're looking for that hasn't quite been struck. I think this bill is closer to the mark than the bill that we saw from Representative Reed last year, but I think still plenty of work to do.
And I think one of the challenges you have with policy like that is writing it, we're obviously writing laws for the entire state and making sure that, what makes sense for a legislator in Seattle also works for a legislator in Yakima. And we have transit in Yakima, we've got, but it's not what Seattle has. And so we worry obviously about the details and how some of our smaller cities get wrapped up into that.
Yeah, so a couple things. Philosophically, we've tried very hard to support the transit bills we've seen in the last couple of years. We've not made it to the finish line. I mean, and then just to be clear, these are not bills that necessarily help our districts all that much, but they don't hurt our districts, and if they help the broader problem, we should support it. In addition to the challenges that we mentioned, the other one is some folks have been so focused on making the development around transit affordable housing, they've made them essentially uneconomical for developers to build. So they've actually, in some ways, that's been one of the challenges in the Senate, is they've made a transit-oriented development bill that didn't actually lead to any development because they made it too restrictive, and we've struggled with that. Now, I am somewhat optimistic on this bill. Senator Bateman, who had a good record of working across the aisle on housing in the House and has done the same thing in the Senate, is working closely with Senator Gaynor on our side, and I think that the challenges we mentioned, I like to think she'll be more open to addressing those. So I'm hopeful in that way, but those are the things that have stopped it from going forward in the past.
There's just one additional element, and that's parking. And I think the biggest issue we've seen in bills in previous years, I used to sit on local government, was you'd have not necessarily the stationary transit, but like your bus routes and things like that, public transportation, is that if you're going to minimize the ability to have parking, which, candidly makes sense, right? And you lose those bus routes, are you then, really not giving transportation options, in the case those routes are taken away? And so I think it works for stationary, but the mobile public transportation, I think that's been one of the big challenges, is how do you balance that parking and keeping options in case there's no longer public transportation in that area?
Can you talk more about the lot splitting bill? I know last year it passed pretty easily through the House. What were the changes that were made to that bill that is making it, because it seems like it's cruising through the Senate side right now, what were the changes that were made from the last year's version of the bill to now that's making it go through a lot faster?
I'm not aware of any changes to the bill. There might be some changes to personnel in the Senate that is causing that change, but I'm not aware of any substantive changes in the underlying legislation.
I think the real change there is we have, a different chair in housing, a slightly different committee, and we've moved some of the bills that used to go local government now go to housing. That will help, I think, as the bill develops. I think ultimately it's got to get across the floor, and we might have some of the same challenges, some of the individual member opposition that we had earlier. But I think we're in better shape this year than last year, not necessarily because of policy changes, just because, we got a different mix in the Senate.
Senator Braun, it's not very often that a bill will pass through unanimously, and I wanted to ask you about 5278 and how that will affect the issue around the amount of detention facilities in the state. How'd you get it out?
Well, I've worked very hard on this. As you know, Green Hill is in my district, and we have a real challenge in our state. We put the JR 25, which, if you don't know, it allows young folks up to the age of 25 to stay in our juvenile rehabilitation program. We put that into law, I think, in 2018, 19. I think there was a pilot, and then finally in 19. It didn't have much effect initially, and then we had the pandemic, and that basically slowed everything down. As we came out of the pandemic, it very quickly built itself into a real challenge in JR, particularly in Green Hill. Much less so at Echo Glen because it's basically lower level sentences, younger folks in Echo Glen for the most part. But we've had a serious overcrowding problem because of JR 25 at Green Hill. Combine that with a fairly a group of folks who have been committed or been convicted rather for very serious, generally violent crimes, a lot of gang activity, and it's just been a recipe for disaster. And a disaster across the board, a disaster for the state. I think that we're going to have, frankly, tort liability for a long time, unsafe for work, for staff, and for the folks that the very purpose of the JR-25 program was to help these folks get back on a better path, and we're definitely not, delivering on that good. They're not getting the services that we intended. They're being put in unsafe environments. They're being subjected to significant danger from the gang and other criminal activity on the facility. You've all read the stories. Been pretty rough. So I think that finally got people's attention. We've spent a lot of time in the last year and a half raising the attention of this issue, and I think people realizing, and we've got great support from the agency itself for this bill, great support from the governor's staff for this bill. It's not exactly the bill that I had hoped for, but it's pretty close, and I think it will give the agency real tools to manage that population to a safe point where we can, in a reasonable way, and it allows for multiple views. And I'm not going to go into the details of the bill, but back to your question, that was all setting the stage for how do you get people to pay attention and listen, and then you just got to work through what's possible and what will work. And I think we're on a pretty good path. There's a few things I'm hoping the House will improve in the bill. I know the agency and the governor's office are committed to trying to improve the bill a little bit more in the House, and I certainly will work in that same direction. But in the end, the answer to your question is, I think folks, whether you like the JR-25 program or not, it's the program, right? That's the law. We got to go do it, and we should do it well. We should do it safe. And the folks who have specifically supported that policy, and I'm not one of those folks. I think that we definitely went in the wrong direction and implemented it poorly. But the folks who support it realize that the very idea is under threat, and if they don't react in a very assertive way, it's all going to go down in a pile. It's just never going to work, and we're going to hurt people. Frankly, we are hurting people now. So I think that made everybody more cooperative, and we got to yes.
The House looks pretty good. You're optimistic.
Well, they had a similar bill in the House that made it quite a ways. It was actually, in some ways, a better bill. I mean, it was closer to the original policy than the bill that came out of the Senate. It didn't make it all the way, but I'm understanding that there's a lot of interest in the bill in the House and a growing recognition that this is something this has got to be on our must-do list for 2025, or we're going to leave a lot of both state employees and residents at our juvenile rehabilitation schools in real danger.
I'm sorry, do you know if Goodman is for it in the House?
I don't know the answer to that question. It's a very good question. I should know the answer to that question, but I don't know the answer. I can tell you his seatmate in the Senate was very supportive.
On that same topic, would your bill eliminate the need to transform Stafford Creek? Have you heard anything about that Governor Inslee proposal? Would that still happen?
So I think in its original form, it would have gone a long ways towards eliminating the need for Stafford Creek. And I appreciate the idea of Stafford Creek. I think that they're a long way from success, even taking away the funding issue, which there's a big funding issue there. They're having trouble hiring, and frankly, and that's just for security, delivering the services that are intended at Green Hill and Echo Glen. I think that's a long path to get there. So a couple issues. One, I think you have a funding issue. Two, you have just a practical implementation. Can you do it in time? On the bill as it passed out of the Senate, I don't think it gives them enough tools to eliminate the need for Stafford Creek. That's one of the reasons I'd like to see it strengthened, to make sure if we don't get where we need to be, and whether it's because of funding or because of implementation at Stafford Creek, that we can still get Green Hill in particular to a safe spot where we're really helping. What you see if you go there, and if you ever have the chance, I would encourage you to visit there. What you see is overcrowding, a group of young folks who are really committed to getting their lives on a better path, but also a pretty big group who aren't really interested. And we have to recognize for what it is, and help the people who are truly committed and want to turn their lives around get there. They deserve that, and recognize if people aren't going to be committed, that maybe there's a better or different solution for them.
Topic. The governor's powers bill died, even though current Governor Ferguson wanted it, Democrats changed it so that Senator Wagner, the sponsor, wouldn't support it. But why not pull that bill and keep it moving in the process to maybe come back and make fixes later instead of letting it die? What's the thinking there?
That's a good question, one we frankly struggled with, because, and give him credit, Governor Ferguson has been great on this issue, and his statement that he would essentially execute the agreement that we negotiated is heartening, frankly. There is still a lot of opposition, even with the fix bill. I should say fix. The bill, as the Democrats changed it coming out of committee, is still. It's not clear to me there's enough support to bring it to the floor from the Senate Democratic Caucus. We have even more negative signs from the House Democratic Caucus and they're just not super interested in that policy. And of course, there's been some, pushback from Governor Ferguson from, actually reaching out and saying, hey, here's a couple Republican policies I might be willing to support. That got some blowback, frankly, and that this is part of it. So, to your question, why not kind of get it better and move it to the House? We went a long ways from where we started, and we just felt like at the point where it is now, it would have no meaningful difference from what current law is. And it didn't look like the reception in the House from the House Democrats, of course, was any better. In fact, looked much worse. So, and frankly, the governor told us before his announcement that was his intention to stick with the plan, and we wanted to respect that because we thought that was a better landing spot.
So in state government, that bill came to state government, and the changes that the Senate Democrats actually made the existing policy worse. It actually watered down what was already current law. And so it's, to take something where you're actually changing it to make it workable, and then your proposal that passed and, unfortunately passed the committee made it worse, just signals that they wanted less involvement of the legislature and really supported the governor continuing to have that unilateral role. When I look at the jobs we do, I remember during COVID how we all came together in those early days to provide the funding to make those tough decisions, to the decisions around students and all of those things. I mean, those are our jobs. We should want to be critically involved regardless of how difficult the decisions ultimately end up being and work with the governor. And I believe that the proposal we had did that, and their proposal went away from that. And so I think that's why you saw the support really, there was none. Frankly, why would you want to weaken what's already a weak law? So.
And I want to be clear on one thing when it comes to emergency powers. This isn't really about the governor. It's really about the legislature. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is by allowing, and we saw this during the pandemic, by allowing the governor to exercise powers without the legislative branch weighing in, it gives the legislatures, in particular majority legislatures, a free pass. They don't have to weigh in on tough decisions, and therefore, and that's really what, when you want to get right down to the kernel, this is about, they don't want to work on this because it provides the legislature cover. They don't have to come in an extended emergency and actually represent the people of their districts by taking a vote. And that's the right answer, and we're going to keep pushing for the right answer. And to his credit, I think Governor Ferguson gets that. He wants wants all parts of government to work as they're intended.
Yeah, this is particularly frustrating because our caucus, both caucuses have been working on this since the pandemic, and we saw what happens when there is no mechanism to provide legislative oversight of an emergency. I think that's only fair when you have checks and balances. This is one area that's a glaring weakness in how it's set up. And my comment to some of my Democrat colleagues was, yeah, the person in the governor's mansion now may have your political priors, but what happens if it's a governor that's not? And my argument is I want to have that check, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, and I think that's only fair. And I think, frankly, it's fair for the governor, right? There's no reason for someone to have to shoulder that long-term responsibility. And if people are going to be under a long-term state of emergency for whatever it is, they should have the right to say, yes, we agree with this part of it. No, we don't agree with this. We want to do something different. That's how it should work, and it works in a variety of other areas. So hopefully we can, and again, I would echo Senator Braun's comments. I appreciate that the governor has said, this is my policy, and hopefully we can enshrine that in the law so we don't have to worry about that going forward.
I want to ask about some of the gun control legislation that's still moving through, ammo taxes, permit to purchase, expanding gun-free zones. Already talk from some groups about, constitutional issues and lawsuits that could come if those move through. What do you think is going to get through ultimately? I know you guys are still going to work to fight those, from what I understand, but what are you most concerned about, I guess, of those bills?
I mean, I'm most concerned about the erosion of our constitutional rights on the federal and on the state level. They are only going after people that are following the law. As a matter of fact, and I'm trying to find the bill number, we had one of the Democrat bills to reduce penalties if you use a gun in a crime, and I can't make that work, right? How on the one hand can you say we have this epidemic of gun violence, and then turn around and say to people who are going to criminally use a gun illegally, say, we're not going to hold you to account. I mean, that just doesn't work. So I agree with you. I think the constitutionality argument is insanely important. A lot of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have said, well, we assume things are constitutional. That's for the court to decide if they aren't. And I wholeheartedly disagree. We all of us in the House and Senate swore an oath to uphold the Constitution. And when you see some stuff that are pretty flagrantly violative of the Constitution, we shouldn't clog up the courts with a case. We should do our job so it doesn't get there.
This is going to sort itself out in the courts long term, which that's the real frustrating thing. It's going to take years for it to sort itself out, and doesn't need to be that way. But I would take a slightly different perspective. We have, this has been a push for several years now. We have arguably, if not one of the most restrictive set of laws when it comes to firearms in Washington State, and yet we've seen our violent crimes, our gun crimes in particular, have grown faster than ever. These are not causally, it looks to me like these are not causally related. We need to be focused on things that are actually going to make people safer. And on those issues, I think there's lots of opportunity for bipartisan work. But instead, if we work on those, whether it's sentencing, whether it's restricting access for folks who are likely to use firearms illegally. I mean, there's things that we can find agreement on, but that hasn't been the interest. The interest has been on just an all-out assault on Second Amendment rights without regard to the real problem, which is keeping our citizens safe from gun violence. And we're not making progress on that. And until we change our approach, I don't think sadly, we're not going to see progress on that.
We've got time for one more question.
Giving us a pass on the last question. Well, thank you very much for being here today. Again, as I said earlier, I appreciate the work you do. It's really important. We don't see as many of you in person as we once did, although I appreciate those who have shown up and participated virtually. That seems to be a good tool. But the work you do in informing our citizens is very important, and I'm very thankful for it. So have a great day.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks all.
Thank you.